Somewhere around year 18 of my career, I remember sitting in a strategy meeting. I won't say which company. They don't deserve the free advertising either way. And having a thought that scared me a little. The thought was, I could leave right now and nothing about me would be lost. Not, I hate this job. Not, I'm burned out. Just this quiet, almost administrative realization that the version of me sitting in that chair wasn't particularly attached to the chair. I want to be clear. That thought did not lead me to quitting the next day, driving to the beach, collecting seashells, and starting a business making puka bead necklaces. It led me to about 2 years of me not knowing what to do with the thought, which, if I'm honest, is a more common outcome than the beach. That's what we're doing today, not how to pivot, not the inspiring version. We're doing how do I know if this is actually the moment or if I'm just tired? Welcome back to Live Without an Expiration Date. I'm Rich Jones. If this is your first time here, I've spent 25 plus years in financial services, mostly credit unions, plus a stretch before that where the U.S. Marine Corps taught me that discomfort and decision making are not mutually exclusive. Now I do fractional executive work. I write, and apparently I have opinions about this stuff on a weekly basis. Today's question is one that I get more than any other, usually disguised as something smaller. People don't walk up to me and say, Rich, should I pivot my career? They say things like, I've just been thinking a lot lately, or I don't know, works fine, but I'm just in a weird spot. That is pivot talk. That's the question wearing a trench coat. Here's my promise for the next 30 minutes or so. I'm not going to tell you how to follow your passion. I'm not going to tell you life is too short. Both of those things might be true, and neither of them is useful when you're trying to figure out whether to blow up something that took you 15 to 20 years to build. What I am going to give you is a way to tell the difference between a real signal and background noise. 3 traps that turn a reasonable instinct into a regrettable decision, and a framework you can actually run your situation through tonight if you want, instead of just marinating in the question for another year or more as I did. Let's get into it. What people actually mean by pivot. Let's start by fixing some vocabulary because pivot has become one of those words that means everything, which means it means nothing. When most people say, I'm thinking about a pivot, they're usually describing one of 3 different situations, and the strategy for each one is completely different. The first is escape. This is get me out of here. It's not really about where you're going, it's about how badly you want to leave where you are. Escape-driven pivots are usually reactive. Something happened, a bad boss, a reorg, a promotion that went to someone else, a gut check about being passed over. And the pivot is really just a fantasy about an exit door. Nothing wrong with wanting out, but an exit door isn't a strategy, it's a relief valve. And the relief valves make you feel better for about 6 weeks before you notice you've just relocated the same problem to a new zip code. The second is expiration. This is different from escape. This is when the role itself has changed, or you have, and the fit that used to exist quietly stopped existing. Nobody did anything wrong. The org didn't betray you. You didn't fit the shape. You just didn't fit the shape of the job the way you used to. or the job doesn't need the shape you're offering. This is actually the most common one I see with people in the second half of their careers. And it's the hardest to name because there is no villain. It's much easier to pivot away from a bad boss than to pivot away from a role that simply finished with you. I talked about this more in the When the Organization Has Moved past You episode a while back. Go back and listen to that if it's ringing a bell. The third is expansion. This one's rarer and honestly more fun to talk about. This is when you're not running from anything. You've just developed a capability, an interest, or a level of expertise that the current role can't hold anymore. You've outgrown the container, not because the container's bad, but because you got bigger. This is the pivot that looks like ambition instead of desperation. And it's usually the one that most people are suspicious of in themselves because they've been trained to think wanting more is somehow greedy or ungrateful. Now, here's why this distinction actually matters practically, not semantically. If you're in escape mode and you don't know it, you'll pivot towards almost anything that isn't your current situation. And about a year later, you'll be having the exact same conversation about the new thing. I've watched people do this twice in a row. Same anxiety, new job title. If you're in exploration and you treat it like escape, you'll rush the exit and skip the part where you figure out what actually fits you now, which means you're likely to land in another role that expires just as fast because you never diagnosed the change. And if you're in expansion and you treat it like escape, you'll undersell yourself. You'll frame the move apologetically. I just felt like I needed a change instead of the truth, which is I got good at something this role can't use, and I'm going to go use it somewhere else. Those are very different conversations to have with a hiring manager, by the way. One sounds like a flight risk, the other sounds like someone who knows exactly what they're worth. So, before we go any further, and I mean this as an actual instruction, not a rhetorical device, think about which of those three you're in right now: escape, exploration, or expansion. Don't answer fast. The honest answer is usually a little embarrassing, which is generally how you know it's honest. Mine, 18 years in, was exploration dressed up as escape. Took me a while to sort that out, and we'll come back to that. The diagnostic, signal versus noise. Okay, let's get into the actual diagnostic work because figure out which category you're in is step one, not the whole exercise. Here's the uncomfortable truth about career dissatisfaction. It is an incredibly common human state, and most of the time it resolves itself without a pivot. You have a bad quarter, your kid's going through something, your best work friend left, leadership changed, and you haven't adjusted yet. All of that produces the feeling of, I need something different, without actually being evidence that you need something different. So, the first job isn't to trust the feeling, it's to interrogate it. Here are the questions I actually use with clients and on myself because I'm not exempt from any of this. Question one: has this feeling been consistent for at least 2 full quarters across different weeks, different projects, different moods? Not, I had a bad month, 6 months minimum of the same undertone. If it's been 3 weeks, you don't have a pivot question, you have a Tuesday. Give it time before you give it a decision. Question 2, can you name what specifically isn't working, or is it just a fog? This is a big one. I'm not happy is not diagnostic. I no longer have any influence over strategy. I'm managing people instead of doing the work that I'm good at. And I have zero interest in learning the new system we're implementing. That's diagnostic. If you can't get specific, you're not ready to pivot. You're ready to journal. And I say that with love. Journaling is underrated and is not the same as a career strategy. Question 3, if your current role changed, different boss, different scope, different comp, would the dissatisfaction actually go away? This is how you tell the difference between a job problem and a career problem. If a new boss would fix 80% of it, you don't need a pivot. You need a different seat at the same table, or possibly a different table at the same company. People blow up entire careers to solve a management problem. I've seen it. It's expensive and unnecessary. And question 4, this one people don't like. Is this about the work, or is this about mattering? A lot of what gets labeled as I need a change is actually I need to feel relevant again. Those are not the same problem. And a pivot doesn't automatically solve the second one. You can pivot into an entirely new field and still feel invisible, especially if you're carrying the same self-doubt into the new room. I've talked about age discrimination and the am I still relevant question on this show before. If that's actually the engine under the hood here, that's worth naming honestly, because no amount of career pivoting fixes an identity question. Only you can do that work. And usually a pivot is the least efficient way to do it. If it is potential age discrimination or concerns of relevancy, you might want to visit those episodes. Question 5, what would you tell a friend in your exact situation? I ask people this constantly, and it's shocking how often the answer arrives in about 4 seconds, fully formed, completely clear-eyed, and completely different from what they've been telling themselves for 6 months. We're all remarkably good advisors to other people and remarkably bad ones to ourselves. If you've got a friend you trust, describe your situation to them in the third person. I have a friend who, it's a little bit of a parlor trick, but it works because it strips out the self-protecting fog. Now, on the other side, there are signals that this is not actually about you needing to pivot. It's about something else needing attention first. You're exhausted, real exhausted, not real exhaustion, not tired of my job, but actually depleted. Makes everything look like a symptom of your career when it might be a symptom of not sleeping, not taking a real break in 3 years, or carrying something outside of work that's bleeding into your experience, how you experience your job. Pivoting while exhausted is like grocery shopping while hungry. Everything looks appealing, and none of it is actually what you need. You just had a bad review, got passed over, or had some other ego hit in the last 30 days. Big decisions made inside of 30 days of an ego wound are rarely good decisions. Not never, but rarely. Give it distance. And this one's blunt, but it's true. You haven't actually tried to fix anything where you are. You haven't had the direct conversation with your boss. You haven't asked for the scope change. You haven't tested the waters internally. If the honest answer is, I haven't tried, then What you have isn't evidence that a pivot is necessary. What you have is evidence that a hard question is overdue and a hard conversation is overdue. Those get confused constantly, mostly because the pivot fantasy is more comfortable than the conversation. The three traps. All right, let's say you've done the diagnostic and it holds up. 6 months specific, wouldn't be solved by a new boss. It's about the work and not just about mattering. And your trusted friend test came back the same way. Real signal. Good. Now I want to warn you about the three traps that take legitimate pivot and turn it into regret. Trap one, the grass is greener fallacy. This is where you compare your actual current job, warts and all, against an idealized fantasy version of the new thing, with none of the warts filled in yet because you haven't lived it. Every job has a version of the thing that's bothering you now, every single one. The specific flavor changes. The existence of some flavor doesn't. So when you're evaluating a pivot, don't compare your real job to an imagined one. Go find someone actually doing the new thing and ask them what's annoying them about it. If they can't answer that in about 10 seconds, they're either new to it or they're not being straight with you. Trap two, sunk cost, but the sneaky version. Everyone knows the obvious version. I can't leave. I put in 15 years into this. That one's easy to spot. The sneaky version is when the sunk cost isn't time, it's identity. You've built 25 years of being known as the marketing person or the ops guy, and whatever your label is, and some part of the pivot means giving up being recognized instantly for that thing. That's a real loss. I'm not going to pretend it isn't, but identity sunk costs will talk you out of a good decision just as effectively as financial sunk cost will. And it's much better to disguise itself as a practical concern. It just doesn't make sense to start over, which means I don't know who I am if I'm not this. And those require completely different answers. Trap three. This is the one I see most in people our age, so pay attention. Confusing a pivot with an escape for the discomfort of being a beginner again. Here's the thing no one says out loud. Pivoting, even a smart, well-diagnosed, thoroughly tested pivot, means being bad at something for a while, being new, asking questions you used to know the answers to instinctively. If you've spent 2 decades being the most competent person in most rooms, that discomfort is genuinely rough, and it will make you want to retreat back to competence even when the pivot is the right call. The trap isn't wanting to pivot. The trap is bailing on it in month 3 because being a beginner feels bad and mistaking that feeling for evidence that you made the wrong choice. Sometimes discomfort is just discomfort. It's not always data. I'll tell you honestly, when I get fractional full times, no safety net, there is a solid 4 months where I was convinced I made a mistake. Every single signal said, this is uncomfortable. And none of those signals were wrong. They just weren't telling me what I thought they were telling me. Discomfort and air look identical from the inside for about the first 90 days. That's just the tuition. The framework. Oh, okay, let's build this into something you can actually use. I've got 4 moves. not a 12-step framework with a note, with a workbook, because you already have a job and a life, and you're not going to do 12 steps. You might do 4. Move 1. Write the specific, not the vague. Take 15 minutes, no phone, and write down exactly what isn't working. Not, I'm unhappy. The actual granular list. I have no autonomy over budget decisions. I haven't learned anything new in 2 years. I dread Mondays specifically because of the 9 a.m. status meeting. Specificity is the whole ball game here because vague problems produce vague and usually wrong solutions. Move 2, test before you leap. Before you make any external move, find the smallest possible way to test the pivot without quitting anything. Talk to 3 people already doing the thing you're imagining. Take on a side project, a board seat, a volunteer role, a consulting gig on the weekends. Something that gives you actual data instead of imagined data. I cannot tell you how many pivots I've watched collapse in month 4 because the person fell in love with the idea of the new thing and had never really actually spent a Tuesday doing it. Move 3, price it honestly. It's not just the money, though obviously start there. What's the real financial runway? What does the transition actually cost? What's your risk tolerance given where you are in life? But also, price has other costs. What does this do to your identity for a while? What does it do to your relationship, your schedule, your sense of competence? A pivot that's financially fine, but that you haven't priced emotionally will still knock you sideways. Price the whole bill, not just the line item, and show up that shows up on the bank statement. Move 4, set a decision date, not a decision feeling. This is maybe the most important one. Don't wait to just know. A lot of people wait for total clarity before they'll move, and total clarity basically never arrives. It's not how big the decision, it's not how big decisions work. Instead, set an actual date. By September 1st, based on what I've learned from the 3 conversations and the side project, I will decide. A date forces the evidence gathering to have an endpoint. Without one, the diagnostic phase becomes a very comfortable place to live indefinitely. I've met people who've been thinking about it for 4 years. That's not deliberation anymore. That's just a very slow way of deciding not to decide. And I'll add a 5th move, even though I said 4, because I break my own rules occasionally. Tell one person the real version, not the polished version. Not your whole network. One person you trust, and tell them the actual mess of it, the fear, the specifics, the ego stuff, not the tidy narrative you'd give a recruiter. Saying the true version out loud to one other human being does something that thinking about it privately doesn't. It's the difference between a thought and a decision that has a witness. I'll close the substance with a quick composite. A few different conversations I've had over the years, blended together so nobody's identity is fully exposed, but the shape is real. Mid-career financial services exec, call her Denise, good title, solid comp, 17 years in, came to me saying almost exactly what I said in the cold open. Nothing was technically wrong, and that was exactly the problem. We ran the diagnostic, 6 months, consistent, check, specific, yes, Actually, once she sat down and wrote it out. She hadn't built anything new in 3 years. She was purely maintaining systems other people had designed. Wouldn't be fixed by a new boss. She actually already had two bosses in that window. Same feeling both times about mattering, not just the work, not just work, partly, but not entirely. There was a real skills mismatch underneath it. Ran her through the traps. Green grass is greener was live. She had a fantasy version of a fintech startup that once she actually talked to two people who worked at one, turned out to have its own version of exactly the tedium she was trying to escape, just worse benefits. Sunk cost was identity based. 17 years of being the credit risk person, the real fear about who she'd be without that label. She didn't pivot industries, she pivoted roles inside the same company into a strategy function that used the same expertise, but actually let her build things again. 8 months later, she's a completely different person on our calls. Same title family, wildly different fit. The point of that story isn't everyone should just move internally. The point is the diagnostic told the truth. It wasn't escape. It wasn't really expansion either. It was exploration of a specific role shape, not exploration of the whole career. And running the actual process got her to the right sized answer instead of the dramatic one. So, is a pivot right for you now? I can't answer that for you. Honestly, anyone who tells you they can after a 45-minute podcast episode is selling you something. What I can tell you is this: most people don't need a leap, they need a diagnosis. Figure out if you're in escape, exploration, or expansion. Run the 5 questions before you trust the feeling. Watch the 3 traps, especially the beginner's discomfort one, because that one's sneaky at this stage of a career. And then use the 4 moves. Write the specific, test before you leap, price the whole bill, set the decision date to turn a fog into an actual answer. The itch is real. That much I'll grant you. What it means is still yours to figure out. If this episode hit close to home, send it to someone who's been just thinking about it for a while. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a friend is have them permission to actually run the diagnostic instead of just carrying the question around. I'm Rich Jones. This has been Live Without an Expiration Date. I'll see you next time.